What if the person everyone dismissed as broken was the only one left who could protect the honor of an entire base? The sun burned across the Nevada desert, but the real heat came from humiliation. Before rows of recruits, a decorated admiral reached out and yanked a Barrett .50 caliber rifle from the hands of a woman they all whispered about, Captain Sarah Whitmore. 38 once feared on battlefields far from home, now reduced to a shadow of her legend. The admiral's smile was sharp, his words colder still. Some cling to weapons they no longer deserve. Laughter rippled quiet, but cruel. Recruits shifted uneasily, caught between obedience to rank and the ache of watching injustice. Sarah's hand, scarred from old wounds, trembled slightly, but her eyes did not. They held a fire no one expected, a storm, gathering behind silence. And then, just when it seemed her story was ending, a whisper cut through the desert air. No one imagined that within minutes the history of this base would take a turn it could never reverse. Captain Sarah Whitmore was not the kind of woman who blended into a crowd. At 38, her face carried the unmistakable lines of endurance cheekbones, carved sharp by desert suns, eyes a piercing blue that once saw further than any scope could measure. She was beautiful. Yes, but not in the polished way of magazine covers. Her beauty was the quiet, solemn strength of someone who had lived through storms and refused to bow. To the unknowing, she looked strong. To those who whispered behind her back, she looked finished. The rifle range became her stage, though not of her choosing. Day after day, she stood before lines of 20-year-old recruits, their fresh uniforms crisp, their voices careless. They were still boys and girls, not yet soldiers, and for them, gossip carried more weight than truth. They had heard the stories, the injury to her left hand, the failed evaluations, the demotion to training duty. Every tremor of her fingers confirmed what they already believed, that the legend of Whitmore the White Falcon had died long ago. Sergeant Red Kowalski made sure of it. A Marine on cross-training assignment, he barked louder than any drill sergeant needed. To his smirk, a constant reminder that he considered Navy instructors soft, especially a damaged one. Whenever Sarah lifted her weapon, Kowalski's eyes narrowed with mockery. "Careful, ma'am. Don't want you dropping that rifle in front of the kids." His tone hovered just above insubordination, but enough to draw chuckles from recruits hungry for a show. Superiors saw the whispers, heard the laughter, and chose the safer path. Silence. They spoke to her with the politeness reserved for the dying, respectful, but void of belief. Reports passed over her desk like she was a filing clerk, not a soldier forged in the mountains of Afghanistan. Commanders shook her hand without looking into her eyes. To them, she was a story that had ended a burden waiting for reassignment. Yet Sarah's life outside the base carried heavier battles. At night, when the desert cooled and the barracks went quiet, she returned to her small quarters and the framed photograph that never left her desk. A man in desert fatigues smiled back at her, his arm wrapped around her shoulder, his eyes the same piercing blue as hers. Her husband lost in a convoy attack years earlier. The war had taken him swiftly, leaving behind a folded flag, a pension, and a daughter too young to understand why her father never came home. Now that daughter was 12, living with Sarah's sister in Colorado, her letters written in uneven script that always ended the same. "Mom, are you coming to my recital?" Or, "Mom, did you get the drawing I sent?" Sarah answered each one faithfully, though her replies never confessed the truth that she carried guilt heavier than her rifle. Guilt that whispered she was failing not only the Navy, but her child as well. Her left hand was the symbol of it all. Scarred across the palm, the injury was the legacy of shrapnel from an Afghan roadside bomb. Medically, it had healed enough for duty, but the tremor never left when she was watched. Alone, her grip was steady, her shots true. Surrounded by eyes, the fingers betrayed her shaking, as if the scar itself remembered the explosion. Instructors called it nerves, recruits called it weakness, and Sarah called it her private prison. Every morning she wrapped the hand tighter in tape, convincing herself that today it would obey. Every evening she set the tape aside and flexed her fingers in the dim light, realizing the tremor was not in the muscle, but in her spirit. She had once been a woman trusted to make impossible shots in impossible places, to watch over platoons who never even knew her name. Now she was a cautionary tale, whispered in mess halls the sniper who couldn't keep her hand still. And so the days blurred. She demonstrated drills, corrected stances, endured Kowalski's sneers. She swallowed the humiliation, because duty still meant something, even when stripped of honor. But the silence inside her grew louder, and with each shake of her hand, the verdict seemed closer. She could feel it in the way commanders avoided her gaze. Her time was running out. Still in the quiet corners of her soul, a question flickered like a stubborn flame. Could she prove them wrong? Could she stand one more time, steady her hand, and remind them that legends do not break? They bend, they suffer, but they do not vanish. Can this woman preserve her honor before the Navy discards her for good? The news spread through the base, the way desert winds carry dust quiet. At first, then everywhere. Admiral Raymond Cole was coming. Not for a ceremony, not for a handshake tour, but for an inspection that would end with names crossed off the roster. He wanted a live fire demonstration, and he wanted it soon. To the younger sailors, it was a chance to impress, a chance to be noticed. To the instructors, it was a storm they could not avoid. And to Captain Sarah Whitmore, it was a summons she had prayed would never come. She heard it first from the lips of a junior officer, his voice half excited, half afraid. The Admiral will be on range by Friday. He wants to see who's worth keeping and who isn't. The words landed heavy like the crack of a rifle shot. By Friday. 3 days. 3 days to prove her worth or to be erased, quietly shifted to a desk, forgotten like a relic, too fragile to keep in service. Around the mess hall, the whispers began again. Recruits nudged each other, eyes darting toward Sarah. Some smirked, others simply looked away, unwilling to meet the gaze of a woman already judged guilty. Even senior officers lowered their voices when she passed, their silence speaking louder than words. She's the obvious target. Kowalski was less subtle. "Looks like your big show's coming up, ma'am," he sneered across the firing line, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "Hope that hand of yours can hold up under pressure." The Admiral's got no patience for broken tools. His words earned nervous chuckles, but beneath them lay a truth nobody questioned. Sarah had been stumbling, and Cole was known for cutting without hesitation. That night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, the desert air pressing in through the thin walls. She unfolded her daughter's latest letter, the childish handwriting, full of innocence. "I miss you, Mom. Don't give up." The words stung. Her daughter could not know what Friday meant, could not know that a mother's career, her identity, her honor, all hung by a thread fraying faster each day. Sarah clenched the letter in her scarred hand. The tremor came uninvited, small at first, then stronger, until she forced herself to lay the paper down. She had seen enemy fire, had survived nights when mortars rained without mercy. But this was a different battlefield. This was the war against doubt, fought under the eyes of her own people. The base itself seemed to feel the weight of the coming trial. Soldiers drilled harder voices, sharper every corridor, buzzing with speculation. By Friday, Admiral Cole's convoy would roll through the gates, and every eye would be fixed on the range. Some careers would be made, others destroyed. And Sarah knew with a certainty that twisted her stomach, that she had been chosen long before the first shot would be fired. Everyone believed this would be her last day, the final chapter of a career that had once burned bright, the closing note of a song that had played too long. But was that really true? The desert morning shimmered with heat, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. On the firing line, a fresh batch of recruits fidgeted with rifles, sweat already soaking their collars. Captain Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, her boots crunching over the gravel, the sound sharp against the restless silence. Today she wasn't just an instructor today, whether she liked it or not. She was a test subject. Demonstrate the stance. Captain, one of the junior officers, called his tone polite, but edged with expectation. All eyes shifted to her, the recruits wide-eyed and eager for spectacle. Kowalski, arms folded, smirk playing at his lips, and beyond them, the looming shadow of Admiral Cole's visit only days away. Sarah lifted the M16, the familiar weight settling into her shoulder. She breathed in, slow and steady. This was muscle memory. She had done this 1,000 times. But as she pressed her cheek to the stock, she felt it, the tremor. Tiny at first, then undeniable. Her left hand quivered against the grip, the scar pulsing like it remembered the blast that had marked her forever. The first shot cracked, echoing across the barren range. Dust plumed a foot wide of the target. A nervous chuckle broke out, quickly stifled. Sarah adjusted, swallowed hard, tried again. The second shot went high, the third low. By the fourth, the laughter was no longer hidden. Recruits exchanged glances, snickers rippling through the formation. "Careful, ma'am," Kowalski muttered just loud enough to be heard. "At this rate, the targets are safer than we are." His comment drew a burst of laughter he didn't bother to hide. Sarah's throat tightened. She forced herself to finish the drill, her shots scattering like broken promises across the dirt. When she lowered the weapon, silence fell, not respectful silence, but the kind that presses like a verdict. Afterward, in the instructor's office, Lieutenant Harris approached her. Younger, ambitious, his voice carried a mix of pity and calculation. "Captain, maybe you should consider a transfer. Personnel's always looking for officers to manage logistics. It's safe, steady. No one would blame you. You've given enough." The word stung worse than the laughter. Safe, steady, given enough. They were the phrases used for those already half forgotten. She wanted to snap back to remind him that she had once guarded lives with her rifle, that she had earned her scars. But the look in his eyes told her the truth. He didn't see a warrior anymore. He saw a liability. That night, her quarters felt smaller than ever. The desert wind rattled the thin window pane, and Sarah sat at her desk, the lamp's glow spilling across the worn photograph. Her husband's smile stared back, arms slung around her shoulder. His presence as real and unreachable as the stars outside. Beside him, a younger Sarah grinned, rifle slung casually, eyes fierce with purpose. She barely recognized that woman. Beside the photo lay her daughter's latest drawing, a stick figure family. 3 hands joined beneath a bright sun. But in the corner, a question scrawled in clumsy letters. "Mom, why don't you smile anymore?" Her chest ached. She pressed the paper flat with trembling fingers, whispering to the empty room. Maybe it's time to give up. Maybe they're right. For a long while she sat in silence, listening to the hum of the bass outside, the muffled laughter of younger voices drifting through the walls. Her reflection in the window was that of a soldier without a battlefield, a mother without answers. The tremor in her hand had spread to her heart, and for the first time, Sarah felt the temptation to surrender. But destiny rarely waits for surrender. In the shadows of her doubt, footsteps were already approaching, the return of a voice she had not heard in years, carrying with it the memory of battles fought side by side. She nearly quit until a shadow from her past stepped in. Sarah didn't notice the footsteps until a shadow stretched across the light spilling from her desk lamp. She looked up, startled, and there she was, Chief Sergeant Helen Ramirez. Ramirez hadn't changed much, though the years had carved their own story into her face. 15 years in uniform had given her hair a dusting of gray, her stance the calm solidity of someone who had seen too much and survived anyway. For Sarah, the sight was like opening a door long sealed shut. "Thought I'd find you here," Ramirez said, dropping into the chair opposite the desk without waiting for an invitation. Her voice carried the same steady cadence Sarah remembered from dusty roads in Afghanistan, from nights when silence was broken only by distant gunfire. Sarah blinked. "You're back at Fallon temporary rotation." Ramirez shrugged. They needed someone who still remembers what a rifle is for. Her eyes swept the room, settling on the photo of Sarah's husband. A softness crossed her face. "I still remember the day we heard. You never deserved that loss." The words landed like a hand on an old wound. Sarah looked away, fingers tightening over the photo frame. "That was a long time ago." "Doesn't mean it stopped hurting," Ramirez replied quietly. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, gaze sharp but warm. "And it doesn't mean you stopped being who you are. I saw you out there today. That wasn't the Sarah Whitmore I know." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "The Sarah you knew is gone. That woman could hit a moving target through a mountain pass in Kunar. That woman didn't flinch. You're still that woman," Ramirez cut in firm. "Don't pretend otherwise. I was there. I watched you take the shot no one else could. 3 rounds, 3 perfect strikes through fog, distance, and chaos. You saved lives, Sarah. You don't forget how to do that." The memory pressed forward, unbidden. Afghanistan, a cold morning in Kunar province. Her sniper team pinned down by insurgents, firing from across a valley hidden in the ridges. Sarah had sighted through the haze, heart steady, pulling the trigger 3 times with the patience of stone. 3 figures fell silent. The rest scattered, and her team lived another day. She closed her eyes, almost tasting the dry air of that valley, hearing the whispered praise that had followed her for years, White Falcon. A name enemies feared, allies trusted. But when her eyes opened again, all she saw was the tremor in her left hand, the scar that marked her as broken. That was then she whispered, "This is now. I can't even keep my hand steady when recruits are watching. What good is a legend that can't last?" Ramirez leaned back, studying her. "Your hand isn't the problem. It's your heart. You've let them tell you what you are until you started believing it yourself." She pointed to the photo of Sarah's father on the wall, a younger man in marine dress, blues jaw, square eyes, proud. "He didn't raise you to surrender." Sarah's throat tightened. Her father's voice echoed in memory. Words spoken on the porch of their old Virginia home, years before she ever put on a uniform. "Honor doesn't live in medals or ranks, Sarah. Honor lives in the choice you make when no one else believes in you. That's the moment that defines you." She pressed her palm against the scarred hand, trying to will it still. "Honor doesn't stop your fingers from shaking." "No," Ramirez said gently, "but it keeps you pulling the trigger anyway." Silence filled the room, heavy but not suffocating. Ramirez let the words hang, giving Sarah space to breathe them in. Finally, she stood, resting a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Friday's coming, whether you want it or not. You can let them write your ending, or you can take the rifle back and remind them who you are. That choice is yours." When the door closed behind her, Sarah sat motionless, heart pounding. The weight of doubt hadn't lifted, but something new stirred beneath it, a spark, fragile but undeniable. Her father's voice, Ramirez's faith, a memory of Kunar. But was faith alone enough to steady a trembling hand before the eyes of hundreds? The desert has a way of swallowing sound, of making even the heartbeat feel too loud. That night, Captain Sarah Whitmore walked across the gravel toward Range 9, the unofficial graveyard of broken rifles and forgotten drills. The air was cold enough to bite the stars sharp against the black sky, like diamonds scattered across endless velvet. She carried the Barrett .50 caliber rifle slung across her shoulder, its weight both anchor and comfort. Alongside it, a canvas bag of match-grade ammunition. To anyone else, it was just a weapon. To Sarah, it was memory. It was identity. It was the part of her life she refused to let die quietly. Range 9 was closed after dark, but Sarah's access as an instructor gave her the key. She unlocked the gate, the metal groaning like it objected, then stepped into the silence. The targets waited mechanical silhouettes lined at different distances, some fixed, some mounted on tracks that could be set in motion. She moved slowly, methodically, setting 6, the closest at 400 meters, the farthest at nearly 1/400. She wanted no mercy from the night. When she settled behind the Barrett, the desert seemed to hold its breath. She loaded the first round, the heavy bolt sliding into place, with a sound she had missed more than any applause. Her hands moved steady, sure, almost reverent. The scar across her palm caught the faint starlight, but tonight there was no tremor. No eyes to judge, no whispers to crush her spirit. Only her, the rifle, and the stars. Her breathing slowed. In, out. She found the rhythm she had once taught to others, the patience of a steady heart, the silence between beats. The first shot cracked through the night like thunder. The echo rolled across the desert hills, startling a bird into flight. Downrange, the 400-meter target rang with the clean sound of steel surrendering. She chambered the second round. The 600-meter target was swaying in the breeze, barely visible through the scope. She tracked it, led it, and squeezed. Another hit dead center. The sound came back, delayed, but true. Third target. Fourth. Fifth. Each one fell with mechanical precision, each impact another piece of her old self, stitching back together. By the time she slid the 6th round into the chamber, she no longer felt the weight of the rifle. It felt like an extension of her, the way it had in Afghanistan, when her shots had names and lives attached. The last silhouette was set at 400 meters, almost invisible, the kind of shot that separated myth from reality. She inhaled, held the air, felt the pause between heartbeats. Through the scope, the world narrowed to a single fragile target under the stars. She squeezed, the Barrett roared, and the silhouette exploded in sparks. 6 shots, 6 targets, 6 perfect strikes. Sarah lowered the rifle chest, heaving the silence around her suddenly deafening. For the first time in years, she felt steady, not because the hand had healed, but because the doubt had loosened its grip. A slow clap broke the stillness. She turned sharply, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle again. Ramirez stood 20 meters away, night vision goggles glowing faint green against her face. She had been watching all along. "Damn," Ramirez said softly, almost in awe. "That wasn't luck. That was the white falcon I remember." Sarah tried to hide the sudden flush in her cheeks. "It's different at night," she muttered. "Nobody's watching. No one waiting for me to fail." Ramirez stepped closer, her boots crunching on gravel. "You think those shots came from your hand?" "No, they came from your heart, from the part of you that refuses to give in." She tapped Sarah's scarred hand gently. "This isn't broken. You've just been carrying the wrong wound." Sarah looked down at the Barrett, still warm from the recoil, the smell of powder heavy in the air. She wanted to argue, to explain the fear that gripped her whenever eyes turned her way, but the 6 destroyed targets behind her argued louder. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Only the wind whispered across the desert, carrying with it the echoes of the past and the promise of something more. Finally, Ramirez broke the silence. "Friday's coming. You prove to yourself what you can do. The question is, will you prove it to them? Sarah turned back to the targets, sparks still faintly glowing on the farthest silhouette. The desert night had given her a gift, the truth that she wasn't finished. But the thought of hundreds of eyes on her, of Cole's smirk, of Kowalski's sneer, it made the tremor threaten to return. Ramirez touched her shoulder, firm and steady. If you could do it under the stars, can you repeat the miracle in daylight before the world? The following day dawned with the kind of desert heat that clung even before sunrise. On the training yard, recruits fumbled through their drills, sweat beating on brows, rifles clattering with nervous hands. Captain Sarah Whitmore stood at the edge of the line, arms crossed, watching every stumble, every crooked stance. She corrected quietly, firmly, though her own heart wrestled with heavier burdens. Kowalski was louder than ever. His voice carried like a whip across the yard. Faster, faster. Marines would have done that twice already. He stopped beside a recruit who had just completed a reload drill. Pathetic. You think that's survival speed? Then he turned deliberately, eyes locking on Sarah. Maybe the Navy likes instructors who can't shoot straight. Sets a good example, doesn't it, ma'am? The recruits laughed nervously, unsure whether to follow his lead or look away. Sarah kept her face impassive, though every word landed sharp. She had faced fire from mountainsides, but this slow erosion of respect, was a different kind of wound. One young sailor, Private Miller, hesitated before asking quietly, "Ma'am, is it true you used to be a sniper? That you had a name? Something like a code?" His tone wasn't mocking, but it was uncertain, the curiosity of someone caught between rumor and disbelief. Sarah's jaw tightened. She dismissed the question with a curt, "Focus on your drill, Private." But the whisper had already spread down the line. Sniper. Call sign. Myth or truth? The recruits wanted a story. Instead, they saw her silence as confirmation of weakness. That evening, Sarah retreated to the office, the air stale with dust and paperwork. She laid out reports she could barely concentrate on. The sound of laughter from outside drifted in Kowalski again, spinning tales at her expense. She pressed her palms against her temples, fighting the tremor rising unbidden. But she wasn't alone. Ensign Parker entered quietly, a stack of files in his hands. Younger than most of the instructors, he had the look of someone who still believed in the clean lines of justice. His eyes flicked to her scarred hand, then back to the folder he carried. "I've been digging," he said softly, setting the file on the desk. "Your record, it's heavily redacted. But I found enough." He opened to a page marked with classified stamps, paragraphs blacked out by thick ink. Only fragments remained, dates, locations, a few numbers. Yet among them, a phrase had survived censorship. Codename White Falcon. Sarah froze. The name hung in the room like an echo from a past life. She hadn't heard it spoken in years, not since Afghanistan. Parker's voice was reverent. "They said you made shots no one else dared attempt. That insurgents whispered your call sign like it was a ghost story. White Falcon, the sniper, who struck before you ever knew she was there." He looked up at her, searching. Was it true? Her lips parted, but no answer came. To admit it was to step back into a world she had spent years burying. To deny it would be a lie that dishonored the men she had saved. She turned away, staring out the window at the recruits, their silhouettes cutting across the desert dusk. Parker closed the file gently. "They don't know who you are. They only see what you've let them see. But I needed you to know someone remembers. Someone believes." He left her there, the folder still open, the name glowing like an ember on the page, White Falcon. Alone again, Sarah pressed her scarred hand against the desk, steady for once. The truth pulsed through her veins. She was not broken. She was hiding. And hiding had its own kind of cowardice. As the desert night deepened, Word spread across the base tomorrow. Admiral Cole's inspection would culminate in a public trial of skill. Every instructor would perform. Every recruit would watch. Every officer, every guest, every whisper would be aimed at her. Tomorrow's trial would not be just about weapons or accuracy. It would be about honor, legacy, and survival. Everyone believed she would fail. Everyone expected her story to end. But tomorrow's public trial could either redeem her or bury her name forever. Friday morning rose clear and merciless. The desert sun sharpened every edge of the Nevada landscape, and by the time the clock struck 8, the base had transformed into something more than a training ground. Rows of recruits stood at rigid attention. Instructors lined the edges, their faces tight with anticipation. Beyond them, black SUVs rolled in dust, trailing like banners of authority. From the convoy stepped Admiral Raymond Cole, his uniform pressed to perfection, his silver hair untouched by the wind. Flanking him were senior commanders, procurement officials, and representatives from the Pentagon. Their presence carried weight promotions, budgets. Futures could be decided with what they saw today. The hum of quiet conversation fell away as Cole raised a hand, smiling the smile of a man who believed he owned the moment. Today, he announced, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd. We will witness the standard of marksmanship that prepares our sailors for the challenges of tomorrow's battles. Each station will demonstrate essential skills: accuracy, discipline, control. He paused, letting his gaze drift until it settled inevitably on Captain Sarah Whitmore. And we will see what our instructors truly teach. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Ramirez gave her a subtle nod from the sidelines, but it did little to ease the weight pressing down. Ensign Parker stood nearby, his eyes fixed on her with a kind of desperate hope. And then Cole's hand gestured toward the long-range precision station. The Barrett waited gleaming on its bipod under the desert sun. Captain Whitmore? Cole set his tone smooth, almost pleasant. Show us. The words were a command, not an invitation. Hundreds of eyes followed her as she crossed the firing line. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. She lowered herself behind the Barrett, the rifle heavy her scarred hand, trembling as it reached for the grip. 6 targets had been set at distances from 400 to 200 meters, the kind of test designed to impress officials, the kind of test Cole had chosen because he expected her to fail. Sarah inhaled, exhaled, sighted in. The first shot cracked. Dust bloomed a foot wide of the target. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not surprise but confirmation. She adjusted, tried again. Second shot, high. Third, low. Her heart hammered in her chest louder than the recoil. By the fourth, whispers spread openly, she's finished. The fifth went wide. The sixth clipped dirt so far off target it might as well have been fired blind. Sarah lowered the rifle. Her hand shook, not from weakness, but from the crushing weight of expectation pressing down like a vice. The recruits avoided her eyes. Some smirked. Kowalski's laugh carried like a victory bell. Admiral Cole stepped forward, his smile practiced. Sometimes, he said, for the benefit of the crowd, it helps to have a fresh perspective. He didn't wait for an answer. He took the Barrett from her hands, lifting it with theatrical precision. Cole knelt behind the rifle, demonstrating every motion as though teaching a classroom. The key, he said loudly, ensuring every officer and official heard, is fundamentals. Breathing. Sight picture. Trigger control. When one forgets the basics, results suffer. The first shot cracked. Dirt erupted 30 yards left of the 400-meter target. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Cole's jaw tightened. Wind compensation, he muttered, adjusting position. He fired again. The round sailed high, missing entirely. The third struck the target frame, splintering wood, but nowhere near center mass. The silence now was different. Not judgment, but disbelief. The Admiral, the symbol of authority, was missing, as badly worse than the woman he had mocked. Cole forced a laugh, setting the rifle aside with obvious distaste. This weapon, he declared, appears to have calibration issues, possibly a misaligned scope, perhaps even a warped barrel. Unacceptable for a demonstration of this importance. His voice rose defensive, almost angry. Some weapons require more maintenance than others. The implication was clear. Sarah was the broken weapon. She was the one unworthy of keeping. He turned away from the Barrett, already shifting the narrative in his favor. But in that moment, something inside Sarah snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. She saw the recruits, the officials, Ramirez Parker. She saw the way truth bent under power, the way lies passed for authority, and she realized she had one choice left. Her voice cut across the range, calm but carrying. 4 words. "My rifle, sir." The crowd stilled. Cole turned, eyes narrowing. Sarah rose slowly. Her shoulders squared, her gaze unflinching. "I'd like my rifle back." A murmur ran through the assembly, a collective intake of breath. The balance of power shifted in that instant, invisible, but undeniable. And just as everything seemed over, Sarah spoke 4 words that turned the world upside down. "My rifle, sir." The 4 words hung in the heat like a challenge etched in glass. Admiral Cole hesitated just a heartbeat, barely enough for anyone to notice, then handed the Barrett back with a tight, practiced smile. Hands changed the balance of power. Metal returned to the woman it knew. Sarah settled behind the bipod, the gravel biting into her elbows, cheek settling to the stock as if coming home to a familiar porch. Silence spread outward in rings. Recruits stopped fidgeting. Officers stilled. Even the wind seemed to draw back, waiting to see what dignity would do when it refused to die. She did not look at the crowd. She looked through the glass. The first target stood at 400 meters, a steel silhouette wavering in thermals. She breathed in, counted heartbeats. 1, 2, let the exhale carry the weight out of her shoulders. Trigger press straight to the rear. The big rifle spoke once, a thunderclap that rolled across the basin. The plate rang clean, and certain a bell struck in a quiet church. No celebration, no glance up. She cycled the bolt, the motion smooth and unhurried, a woman remembering a language she had not forgotten at all. 600 meters next. A sliver of crosswind tugged the mirage in the scope, a gentle right to left. She gave it the inch it asked for. Press. Strike. The second plate shuddered, white paint bursting like breath in winter air. Voices started somewhere behind her, surprised, involuntary, but she was already moving, not faster, just more sure. The rifle and the woman were one line drawn across a long canvas. 800. The sun crawled higher, the air shimmered. She rolled her shoulder into the stock and let the math do its quiet work, drop, drift distance. Press. The third plate rocked and settled. In the stands of officers, a procurement colonel leaned forward without meaning to. Ramirez exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath all morning. Ensign Parker's eyes shone the kind of hope a young officer keeps close for emergencies. 900. The tremor that haunted her in daylight did not return. She had built herself a small room inside the noise, and in that room there was space only for breath and steel. Press. The fourth plate snapped a neat kiss at center mass. Somewhere to her left, Kowalski's smirk thawed into something more uncertain. He folded his arms, then unfolded them as if his body couldn't decide what to do with its own doubt. 1,100. No theatrics. She adjusted elevation just 2 clicks and checked her natural point of aim. She felt the buttstock like the palm of a father's hand, between the shoulders, steadying, wordless. Press. The fifth plate rang with that same patient note, not loud, but undeniable. A murmur rippled across the range. It wasn't applause. It was belief remembering what it sounded like. 1,200 the farthest of the static line. Heat shimmer turned the silhouette to a ghost. She refused to hurry. She let herself remember Kunar, not the danger, not the fame, but the quiet before each choice. Wind a whisper, earth curving under a long flight, bullet drop measured in humility. She found the stillness between heartbeats and pressed. The sixth plate answered like a lighthouse bell in fog, clear enough to find home by. Sarah eased the rifle safe and only then lifted her head. The world rushed back in a wave, boots scraping hats, tilting whispers breaking into voices. She heard nothing specific, only the sound of a crowd realizing it had been wrong. Wrong about failure? Wrong about what breaks? Wrong about who deserves to carry a weapon and a name? Cole stepped forward, color high on his cheeks, the mask still fixed, but fraying at the edges. "Impressive," he said, and the word sliced thin as paper. Perhaps the earlier calibration issues were temporary. He reached for the rifle, as if reclaiming an object that belonged to rank, not to mastery. Sarah's hand was already there. Not defiant, correct. Her voice carried the steady cadence of a range command. "Sir, the shooter retains control until the line is cold." The sentence was not challenge, but doctrine, a rule older than egos. He grasped again, fingers closing over the handguard. The barrel swung a few degrees off the berm, and that was when training overruled etiquette. She moved not with anger, but with precision, economy of motion learned from instructors who knew that safety is love made visible. Her left hand slipped along his wrist, rotating his thumb toward his forearm, the way a door knows which way it wants to swing. Her right hand anchored the forend down to earth. She shifted her hips, gave him the path of least resistance, and his knees found gravel before his pride could. It was not a strike, but a control, the kind used to keep a panicked friend from hurting himself. The rifle stayed pointed downrange. The action stayed open. The range stayed safe. "Sir," she said, voice even, breath unbroken, "please release the weapon." For a heartbeat, fury flashed in his eyes. Then his own training answered. He let go. She set the Barrett on safe and cleared it out loud for the line to hear, chamber clear. Magazine removed. Bolt locked to the rear. Ramirez's voice joined from the sideline. "Line is cold," and the tension that had pooled around boots and in throats drained out across the gravel. No one moved. And then the sound came, not explosive, but building first one pair of hands, then many, then nearly all. Applause rolled like distant surf. It was not for spectacle. It was for order restored, for truth affirmed, for the quiet courage of a woman who remembered who she was when it mattered. Sarah did not bow. She did not smile. She simply stepped back from the bipod and stood at ease, eyes level, chin steady. She looked at no one in particular, and at everyone at once, as if to say, "This is not about me. This is about the standard. This is about doing right when the easy thing would be to shrug and let the powerful rewrite what we all saw." Across the line, recruits who had snickered that week felt heat creep up their necks. One of them, Miller, straightened his back without knowing why. He understood in a way that would not leave him that respect is not granted by volume or title. It follows competence, like a shadow follows light. Parker's hands didn't clap at first. He was too busy watching the officials. A captain from personnel had stopped taking notes and started listening. A procurement lead whispered to a colleague and pointed subtle but not lost on the young ensign. He saw futures moving possibilities, tilting doors that had been shut ease a fraction on their hinges. Cole rose, brushing dust from his knees with short, angry motions. He forced a steady breath and a neutral tone. We will of course have the armorer inspect this rifle. We can't allow equipment irregularities to compromise training standards." He tried to step past what had happened, to fold it into a narrative where rank remained intact, even as truth refused to cooperate. Sarah nodded once. "That would be prudent, sir." Her agreement took the sting out of his retort and left it harmless. She had not humiliated him. She had controlled a dangerous moment with grace. The crowd could feel the difference. That difference was the point. Ramirez met Sarah's eyes across the distance and gave the smallest of nods. "You did not just shoot well. You led well." And leadership, when it is quiet and unflinching, restores more than reputations. It restores order to places where fear had started to masquerade as policy. Cole looked out over the range and found to his surprise that his smile did not return. For the first time, he seemed uncertain which way the wind was blowing. He gestured curtly to move the demonstration along, but momentum was no longer his to command. The base had seen something it would not unsee. Sarah stepped away from the Barrett and let the applause fade on its own. She did not chase it. Applause is weather pleasant passing. She was after something more permanent, something she could write in the hearts of the young with the ink of example that the work is the reward, that honesty is the only calibration that matters. Beside her, Parker spoke without looking over voice, low enough for only her to hear. "Ma'am, I don't think this ends here. It wasn't warning so much as wisdom." He had seen the set of Cole's jaw the way wounded pride looks for softer targets. Sarah answered with a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. "That's all right, Ensign," she said softly. "We didn't come this far for it to be easy." Behind them, the steel plates downrange still swayed on their hinges, slow and satisfied, as if nodding agreement. 6 shots. 6 answers to 6 accusations. 6 small promises that truth can still find its mark in bright daylight. The crowd would talk for weeks about what they had witnessed in those few minutes. Some would remember the sound of steel struck true. Some would remember the calm of a voice quoting range rules when tempers ran hot. But most would remember a woman whose hands had been steady because her soul had decided to be. And yet beneath the relief, beneath the applause, and the sudden warmth of admiration, another current moved darker and colder. Pride, when cornered, does not surrender. It looks for a back door, a shadowed corridor, a file that can be edited in the quiet after the lights go down. But that was only the beginning. The hardest part was still ahead. The applause did not fade quickly. It grew, rolling across the firing line in waves. Recruits who had once snickered now clapped until their palms stung. Officers who had stood stiff and silent allowed themselves nods of approval. Even the Pentagon officials leaned closer, their expressions bright with the recognition that they had just seen something extraordinary. Ensign Parker stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd, young but steady. "White Falcon isn't a legend," he declared. "She's real. She's standing right here." For a heartbeat, the name hovered like a secret revealed. Recruits gasped, exchanging glances, the whispers racing faster than the applause itself. White Falcon. The sniper who had been spoken of in hushed tones overseas. The myth who could thread a bullet through fog and fear alike. Now the myth had a face, and it was the woman who only minutes before had been dismissed as broken. Sarah felt the weight of the name settle on her shoulders again, not as a burden this time, but as a mantle. She did not smile, but her chin lifted. She met the recruits' eyes one by one, letting them see that legends are not made of magic. They are forged from scars, persistence, and the refusal to yield. The applause swelled again, recruits cheering openly now. Kowalski, silent for once, lowered his gaze. Ramirez allowed herself the faintest of grins, arms folded, as if to say, "I told you so." For Sarah, the reward was not the cheers or even the recognition of her call sign. It was the sight of young sailors standing straighter, hope flickering in their eyes. It was the knowledge that her daughter somewhere far away would one day hear this story and understand what it means to keep fighting when the world calls you finished. But beyond the clapping hands and brightened faces, another figure stood apart. Admiral Cole, his wrist still sore, his pride wounded deeper than bone, forced a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. He clapped once, twice, hollow perfunctory, before lowering his hands. His gaze swept the range, not on Sarah, but on the officials, the recruits, the whispers he could not control. His jaw tightened, his breath, slow and deliberate. Sarah sensed it even without looking directly at him. This victory, as sweet as it felt, was not the end. Pride, especially pride wrapped in power, rarely concedes gracefully. She had earned back her honor in the eyes of the many, but in the eyes of the one man who had sought her downfall, the war had only just shifted to a darker battlefield. The applause washed over her steady as a tide, but beneath it, she could already feel the undertow. Cole wasn't finished. Night fell heavy over Fallon. The desert heat gave way to a sharp chill, and the base quieted into the low hum of generators and the distant shuffle of guards on duty. To most, it was just another evening. But in Admiral Cole's office, the air carried a different weight. Cole sat stiffly, his right wrist wrapped a tumbler of untouched whiskey sweating on the desk. Across from him stood two junior officers, both uneasy but trapped by rank. Cole's voice was low, deliberate. The files from today's demonstration, he said, tapping his desk with a slow rhythm, need to be corrected. Adjust the shot logs, reassign the impacts. The data should show inconsistent performance, missed targets, embarrassing lapses. One officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with respect, the official saw Cole's eyes snapped up sharp as a blade. They saw a performance. What remains in the record is what matters. And the record will reflect that Captain Whitmore failed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Both men nodded, saluted, and left with hurried steps. Cole leaned back, exhaling through clenched teeth. Legends only live if you let them. And I won't let this one rise at my expense. Down the hall, Ensign Parker lingered in the shadows. He hadn't meant to overhear, but the Admiral's words had carried just far enough through the cracked door. His stomach tightened. If the data was altered, Sarah's triumph would vanish into rumor, twisted back into failure. Her name would be buried again. Parker didn't wait. He ran. He found Ramirez in the instructor's lounge, arms folded, boots, propped on a chair, pretending to read reports. One look at Parker's face, and her eyes sharpened. What is it? He caught his breath. Cole's rewriting the record. The data files he's sending officers to the data center now. Ramirez dropped her papers already on her feet. Then we don't have time to talk. Let's move. The data center sat on the far edge of the base, a squat concrete building humming with servers and humming fluorescent lights. Inside, two of Cole's men typed quickly lines of code, scrolling as they transferred range data into altered files. Each keystroke chipped away at Sarah's redemption. Parker and Ramirez burst through the door. Step away from that terminal, Ramirez barked, her voice carrying command that outstripped her rank. The officers froze. One stammered, "Chief, this is a direct order." "Orders don't cover falsifying official records," Ramirez cut in. Her hand hovered near her sidearm, not drawing but ready. "You're tampering with evidence. That's a court-martial offense." The room went tense, the fluorescent hum suddenly louder than breath. One officer hesitated, guilt flashing in his eyes. The other reached for the keyboard again. Parker lunged, grabbing his wrist before he could hit enter. The two struggled, chair clattering to the floor. The screen blinked, warning overwrite in progress. Ramirez moved fast, shoving the second officer away from the terminal, her voice sharp as broken glass. Not tonight. The fight was clumsy, desperate. These weren't soldiers trained for combat. They were paper officers caught between conscience and fear. But fear makes men reckless. One swung wildly at Parker, grazing his cheek. Parker tightened his grip, driving the man back into the desk. Ramirez held her ground, keeping the other away from the main terminal. Parker, the file, save it, now. Parker scrambled, fingers flying over the keyboard. He canceled the override hard hammering as the system blinked, file integrity preserved. A backup flashed onto a secure drive, the green bar crawling to completion. The door banged open again. Cole's shadow filled the frame. His eyes narrowed, his voice cold. What exactly is going on here? Ramirez turned, breath steady, hand still resting near her hip. Protecting the truth, sir. Cole's gaze dropped to the screen where Sarah's perfect shots still glowed in digital permanence. The fury in his face was almost physical. He stepped forward, but Parker pulled the drive free, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. The evidence is safe, Parker said, his voice shaking but resolute. Cole's lips pressed thin. You have no idea what you're doing, Ensign. You're ending your career before it begins. Maybe Parker answered, surprising even himself. But I'm not ending hers. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ramirez spoke, calm, almost quiet. Sir, the file stays as it is. And tomorrow, so will the truth. Cole's jaw clenched. He turned sharply, storming out with words unspoken, but his silence was more dangerous than threats. Outside, Parker leaned against the wall chest, heaving the drive still tight in his grip. Ramirez clapped a hand on his shoulder. You just painted a target on your back, kid. I don't care, Parker said. At least the record can't be buried now. Ramirez looked toward the desert sky, stars wheeling above. Don't be so sure. Cole's not the kind of man who lets go. If the evidence vanished, the truth would be buried once more. The morning broke with a cruel brightness, as if the desert sun itself was eager to expose someone. By 8 o'clock, the parade ground was packed once more. Recruits lined in formation, instructors flanking them, and the Pentagon delegation gathered with curious, almost hungry eyes. Word had spread of the miracle on the range, 6 shots, 6 hits, but whispers were already twisting. Admiral Cole had made sure of that. Sarah Whitmore stood at attention, shoulders square, though the weight of doubt pressed hard. She felt the storm coming before she saw it. Cole stepped forward, bandaged wrist tucked behind his back, like it was nothing more than a nuisance. His smile was sharp, his voice ringing with authority. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with today's program, there is a matter of grave concern. What appeared yesterday to be extraordinary marksmanship. He paused, letting anticipation simmer. Was in fact an illusion. The recruits shifted uneasily. Officers murmured. Sarah's jaw tightened. Cole continued, words measured but poisonous. Upon review of the data logs, irregularities were discovered. Evidence suggests that Captain Whitmore's demonstration was manipulated, either through faulty equipment or deliberate tampering. In plain terms, she cheated. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some recruits looked shocked, others relieved, as if the world had snapped back into the version they understood, the broken officer exposed. Cole's gaze swept the assembly, pausing just long enough on the Pentagon officials. The Navy cannot afford fraud parading as excellence. Effective immediately, I am recommending Captain Whitmore's removal from instructor duty, pending full review. Sarah's throat burned, but she said nothing. To protest would sound like desperation. To stand silent was to let the accusation root deeper. Around her, she felt the same whispers that had stalked her for months, curling back like smoke. Fraud. Washed up. Finished. Then a voice broke the air. That's a lie. Every head turned. Ensign Parker stood near the edge of the crowd chest, heaving a small black USB drive clutched in his hand. His uniform was rumpled, his face still marked from last night's scuffle in the data center, but his voice carried steady clear. He strode forward, ignoring Cole's glare. "Sir, with respect, you're leaving out evidence. Evidence you tried to bury." Cole's face flushed, but Parker didn't falter. He turned to the officers, then to the recruits. "I have footage untouched, unedited. Captain Whitmore alone on range 9. 6 shots, 6 targets, 1,400 meters at night. No audience, no applause, no chance for trickery. Just skill." Murmurs rose this time in Sarah's favor. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for proof. Cole barked, "This is outrageous. That material is unauthorized, obtained illegally." But Parker had already handed the drive to the tech officer at the podium. A screen flickered to life. The desert night appeared starlit sky. Sarah prone behind the Barrett, the muzzle flash lighting the range. 6 shots, 6 targets dropping one after another. The echo of steel rang even through the grainy audio. No commentary, no trick, just truth. When the footage ended, silence followed, but it was a silence filled with weight, not doubt. Ramirez stepped out from the sidelines, voice calm, but firm. "There's your evidence. Not cheating, not tampering. Just a soldier remembering who she is." The Pentagon officials exchanged glances. One of them, a stern-faced captain, spoke aloud. "Admiral Cole, it appears your accusations lack merit. In fact, they suggest misconduct on your part." Cole's composure cracked. "You can't seriously believe," but the official's tone cut like steel. "Until further notice, Admiral, you are suspended from duty, pending full investigation." The words landed harder than any bullet. Cole's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to argue, but the escorts were already moving toward him. His bandaged hand twitched against his side, a small broken echo of control slipping away. The crowd parted, watching as the man who had stood untouchable the day before was led off the field. His career collapsing not with glory, but with disgrace. For Sarah, it felt less like victory than release. She exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to Parker. The young ensign's hand still trembled, but his chin was lifted high. He had been the shadow in the background, the one no one expected to matter, and in the end, he had saved her. Their eyes met. Parker nodded once, almost shyly. "White Falcon doesn't hide anymore," he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not for legend, not for applause, but for truth, finally free. The recruits broke into applause again, louder this time, and now it was not the polite clapping of observers, but the raw cheer of believers. Sarah stood steady, letting the sound wash over her, without bowing to it. She had not fought for their applause. She had fought for her name, for honor, for the daughter who would one day ask what kind of soldier her mother had been. Cole was gone. His career lay in ruins, and Sarah, scarred, doubted, nearly discarded, stood reborn. The desert seemed quieter in the days that followed. The clamor of whispers had faded. In their place came a steadier hum of respect. Sarah Whitmore found herself summoned to the base commander's office. Inside, a visiting officer from the Pentagon, Captain Sarah Mitchell, waited with orders in hand. "You've been overlooked for too long," Mitchell said plainly. "Your record, your skill, your leadership, they belong back where they can shape the sharpest edge of the Navy. Special Warfare Command is requesting you. If you're willing, we'd like you to train the next generation of operators." Sarah felt the words sink in, heavy but warm. She gave a simple nod. "I'm willing." Later that week, under a blazing Nevada sun, the recruits she had trained gathered for their farewell formation. Faces that once carried doubt now shone with pride. Some would head to ships, some to aviation, some to deployments still unknown. But each carried with them a memory of a woman who had stood steady when the world wanted her to fall. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying across the field. "Honor isn't in the eyes of others," she said. "It isn't in medals or titles or rumors. Honor lives in the moment you do right, especially when everyone believes you will fail. That's when character is tested. That's when truth shines brightest." The recruits stood taller. Some swallowed hard, others blinked against the sun. They knew they had heard something more than instruction. They had been given a compass. That night in her quarters, Sarah found a letter waiting. The handwriting was uneven, childish, but strong. She opened it carefully. "Mom, I heard what you did. They say you saved your honor. But to me, you didn't need to. You were always my hero. I love you." Her throat tightened. For all the battles fought in deserts and ranges, this her daughter's faith was the only victory that truly mattered. She pressed the letter to her chest and let the silence of the room hold her. The narrator's voice came as if speaking to every heart watching. We live in a world where prejudice whispers louder than truth, where doubt often drowns discipline. But stories like Sarah's remind us what breaks us does not have to end us. Prejudice can be faced. Truth and discipline still have value. And one person's courage can inspire the next generation. Every viewer knows this moment, even if they've never held a rifle. That moment when the world seems certain of your failure. That moment when standing tall feels impossible. And yet, it is in those very moments that we discover who we are. As the video faded, the voice softened. If this story touched, you share it. Leave a comment, because you too may have a moment when you must stand tall, and someone else may need your courage to light their way. The screen dimmed. Only the echo of truth remained.